Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when flowers had the audacity to become a political statement. And yes, tulips were basically the influencers of the Ottoman Empire. You find yourself drifting into the early 18th century, where the scent of opulence, bureaucracy, and just a pinch of delusion fills the air. The roads are dusty, the sultans are moody, and the flower beds are disturbingly well-funded. You're standing on the edge of Istanbul, still called Constantinople by your uncle who refuses to update his vocabulary, surrounded by sprawling gardens and silk-robed gardeners who take their tulips more seriously than their paychecks. The year is somewhere around 1718. The empire has just signed the Treaty of Passarowitz, and suddenly, peace has broken out. Horrifying, right? No wars, no sieges, just vibes, which gives the Ottomans far too much time to stare at flowers. You probably won't survive this because honestly, the drama is floral, the stakes are botanical, and the chaos is politely potted. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there? I'm always curious who else is staying up way past a reasonable hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the tulip era, or l'Aile d'Evry, if you want to impress someone at brunch tomorrow. This wasn't just any old historical blip. No, this was an era where tulips became a cultural currency. Imagine NFTs, but floral and slightly less environmentally problematic. Historians still argue whether the tulip era truly counts as a golden age or just a beautifully decorated fever dream. But what they all agree on is that it was weirdly delightful. The ruling sultan at the time, Ahmed III, is lounging on a silk divan somewhere, probably sipping something expensive and exotic while someone reads him poetry about how a tulip bends in the breeze. His Grand Vizier, Nefsehurli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, whose name is a syllabic obstacle course, loved tulips so much he practically turned government policy into petal cultivation strategy. Yes, really. You follow a silk-robed official as he walks into yet another meeting that has somehow turned into a flower appreciation session. He unfurls scrolls not of trade routes or tax records, but of tulip inventory. The Sultan, he says, requires 36 more crimson phoenix bulbs by Friday. You sigh. This meeting could have been an email, but the obsession didn't bloom out of nowhere. Tulips had journeyed far before landing in Ottoman hearts. Native to the steppes of Central Asia, tulips had been around since medieval Persian poetry was still the equivalent of a TikTok duet, brief, dramatic, and involving deep feelings about nature. By the time the Ottomans got hold of them, tulips had gained a mystique. Fragile, ephemeral, absolutely Instagrammable if they had Instagram. At this point, you're passing through one of the early public parks commissioned by the vizier himself, an early attempt at making tulip appreciation a shared experience. Men in robes lean over blooms, muttering in low voices about petal curvature. Children play, but only very, very quietly. The flowers are watching. Here's the kicker. Tulips bloomed for just a few days in spring. That's it. So this empire spent the rest of the year preparing for a week that might be ruined by one badly timed rainstorm. Peak anxiety. Still, the anticipation was part of the magic. The build-up made it sacred. A tulip wasn't just a flower. It was a symbol of fleeting beauty, of divine perfection, of the annual reminder that yes, everything you love will die, but at least it'll look stunning while doing it. One historian jokingly called the tulip era a bureaucratic garden party spiraling out of control, which feels accurate. The Sultan began issuing imperial decrees limiting who could grow which types of tulips. Commoners were restricted from acquiring the fanciest ones, because obviously, the aesthetic should remain elite. Imagine your HOA, but armed with janissaries. And yet, among all the tightly pruned beds and perfumed evenings, some fringier facts rustle their leaves. There were whispers that tulip bulbs were being eaten during harsh winters, not as delicacies, but out of desperation. One French traveler claimed to have seen a family boil tulips and pretend it was soup. Historians still debate whether this was true or just a snarky way to critique Ottoman luxury culture. Either way, petals weren't always poetry. But back to our stroll. You veer into a quieter alley, where an old calligrapher sits hunched beneath a carved archway. He's drawing tulips, not the flowers, but their stylized forms, each brushstroke mimicking a stem's curve. Tulips, to Ottomans, were not just biology but calligraphy, geometry, even theology. Did you know the Arabic spelling of Allah resembles a tulip if you squint just right? Yeah, that fact gets passed around like gossip at a tea house. You keep moving, watching how this seemingly boring plant has infiltrated everything. Architecture, tulip domes, ceramics, covered in floral motifs, poetry, practically unusable without at least one tulip metaphor per stanza. Even the Janissary barracks aren't safe from decorative tulip tiles. One might imagine the elite soldiers exchanging tulip seeds along with spears. Somewhere, behind a thick curtain of lavender scent and incense, a debate still lingers. Was the tulip era a brilliant cultural renaissance, or just the empire's sparkly distraction while economic termites chewed away beneath the surface? Historians still argue. And you, gently lulled by the soft hum of bees and distant lute music, begin not to care. Because here, in this dream of petals and politics, everything slows. The streets narrow, the voices lower. A breeze lifts a single red petal and spins it in the air. You don't reach for it. You just watch. You blink slowly, still strolling beneath the embroidered canopy of early Ottoman spring. And now you're entering the halls where power breathes in silk and exhales poetry. The palace of Topkapi looms ahead. Not a castle so much as a quiet sprawl of pavilions and hidden corners, where every garden seems to whisper in tulips. Inside, Sultan Ahmed III reclines, not reclines like a man resting after hard labor, but like a man who's never carried anything heavier than a brocaded cushion. He's not exactly what you'd call the warlord type. He prefers quiet, art, calligraphy, and, of course, tulips. His harem? Gorgeous. His treasury? Overflowing. His greatest love? The keyflail, a pale violet tulip with streaks like smoke. So rare it was once stolen during a state banquet. Yes, someone risked execution for a bulb. Priorities. You pass a window where the Sultan is holding a tulip salon. Basically a book club, but for botanists and minor poets. The air smells like ambergris and confidence. A scholar reads a poem aloud, something about how tulips weep dew from joy. Another man, a court painter, nods solemnly and adjusts his hat, which is shaped like an upside-down teacup. Fashion is unwell. At the height of the tulip era, being into tulips wasn't just acceptable, it was expected. If you were a courtier, you better have an opinion on pistil length. If you were a vizier, you needed a favorite cultivar, ideally one named after your late mother. And if you were the sultan, you needed the biggest, most expensive garden, preferably with water features, and flamingos, just because. You shuffle into the private chambers, trailing behind a servant who's carrying a velvet pouch. It jingles faintly. No, not coins, bulbs. These are special. They're being shown to the sultan like diamonds, placed on a lacquered tray. Each one comes with a parchment label describing color, bloom time, and, oddly, temperament. This one is shy, says the gardener. It only opens if sung to. Historians still argue whether Ahmed III's tulip obsession was a genuine passion or a deliberate political move to soften the empire's image post-war. Maybe both. He was, after all, dealing with a nation tired of battle. Flowers speak of peace, of refinement, of beauty without violence. It was a vibe shift Ottoman edition, but not everyone loved the floral aesthetic takeover. You might catch a grumble from the Janissaries, those elite soldiers who once stormed fortresses and now found themselves decorating imperial parades with flower-shaped lanterns. It's like if your neighborhood SWAT team had to host a bake sale in costume. There were even rumors that some soldiers refused to wear the tulip pins. A man is not a bee, one anonymous complaint read. He need not pollinate. Among the quieter consequences of all this tulip talk was the explosion in court artistry. You pause near a small atelier nestled in a courtyard off the harem wing. Inside, a team of artisans is etching tulips into mother-of-pearl. A scribe is composing a scroll of fictional tulip lineages. Yes, fantasy genealogies for flowers. A girl in the corner is painting a tulip with 12 shades of red. It looks exactly like the one next to it. No one says anything. One quirky tale involves a court dwarf named Zulfikar, who allegedly trained a parrot to recite tulip types on command. The bird would screech out things like, "Golden Sultan," or "Moonlit Thief," which sounds like a florist's menu but was actually the highlight of more than one banquet. Historians remain divided on whether this parrot truly existed or was a metaphor for sycophantic poetry critics. Sultan Ahmed III wasn't alone in his obsession. His Grand Vizier, the infamous Damit Ibrahim Pasha, matched the Sultan tulip for tulip. Together, they weren't just running an empire, they were curating it. Their goal? Civilize the nation with aesthetics. A gentle tyranny of taste. But tulips weren't just for show. They crept into ceremonies, into diplomacy, even into espionage. You listen as a eunuch explains how rare bulbs were sometimes gifted to foreign dignitaries as a coded signal of favor or disdain. A healthy, blooming bulb? An open hand. A withered one? A quiet insult. The Dutch ambassador once received a single petal wrapped in silk. He sent back a cactus. Relations cooled. One spring evening, Sultan Ahmed hosts what can only be described as a garden rave, albeit a 1700s version. Oil lamps hung from trees, performers weaving between guests dressed as personified tulips. Somehow this is not satire, and musicians playing instruments shaped like flowers. You watch from the shadows, bemused and a little sleepy. It's a fever dream with a dress code. As you walk through the garden that night, it's not hard to see the appeal. The empire, bloated with history and held together by old maps and older grudges, suddenly feels young again. New, soft. People smile more. The breeze feels intentional. The sky is full of stars that seem choreographed. But under it all, something buzzes. Like bees in a bouquet that's been too still, too perfect. You hear a whisper among the shadows. How much did he pay for that one? 3 bags of silver. For a flower? The word echoes like a warning. Still, for now, Sultan Ahmed reclines. A servant feeds him candied rose petals. A musician plucks a tune called Ode to the Ivory Tulip. And somewhere, deep in the harem garden, the rare black night tulip finally opens. Alone, in the dark. You keep walking. You leave the palace walls behind, your steps lighter now, the scent of rose water and lantern smoke fading into the night. You drift toward a quieter part of Istanbul, a district where only the most meticulous, slightly mad garden masters reside. This is where tulips become less a symbol and more a science. Welcome to the city's living laboratory of petals. You walk past stone walls cloaked in ivy, through wooden gates that groan like they're judging your lack of botanical knowledge. Inside, perfection, or at least the obsessive pursuit of it. Rows upon rows of tulips grow not for beauty alone, but for competition. These aren't just flowers. These are champions. Each bulb is tagged, tracked, and whispered to. One gardener, wearing a vest embroidered with tiny tulips. Yes, even his fashion is florally aligned. Gently mists a single flower and murmurs something that sounds suspiciously like, "You're doing great, sweetie." You stand corrected. This tulip has emotional support. It's not just eccentricity. During the tulip era, hybridization was serious business. Crossbreeding tulips became a kind of national sport for the elite. Historians still argue whether this was an actual proto-science or glorified superstition, but either way, the results were often astonishing. Shades that shimmered between violet and crimson, petal shapes that curled like calligraphy, even tulips that opened at dawn and closed at noon, as if observing their own royal hours. You stop at a bench beneath a fig tree. Across from you, a man in a fur-lined robe is holding what looks like a pregnancy scroll, but it's just a genealogy chart. For tulips, he's tracing the bloodline of a bloom called Silver Dawn, back 10 generations. She was born from Moonlight's wish, he says proudly, then adds, but we don't speak of Night's regret. Tulip family drama. Better than most Netflix plots. You venture deeper into the garden district and discover one of the crown jewels. An experimental tulip field maintained by imperial decree. Fenced off, guarded, and strangely silent. It's like Area 51 but for petals. The Ottoman elite funneled gold into the space like it was a defense budget. Tulip taxes were real. Gardeners had state salaries. Even failures were recorded meticulously. Bulb refused to sprout, possibly offended by soil. Of course, no scientific progress is complete without some healthy paranoia. A rumor floats through the street markets about a Dutch spy who tried to smuggle out rare tulip bulbs hidden inside loaves of bread. Whether that's true or not, you have to admit, it's a story with layers. Historians still debate if these tales were political satire or genuine panic over agricultural espionage. Either way, you find yourself eyeing bakery goods with suspicion. What's fascinating is how tulip breeding bled into other aspects of Ottoman life. You pause outside a ceramics workshop. Inside, artisans glaze tulip designs onto tiles with shades that match the living specimens. They're not copying the tulips. They're racing them, trying to paint a color that nature barely sustains. In one corner, an apprentice cries because her glaze came out one hue too blue. You feel that. Some scholars say this period marked the start of modern aesthetics in the empire. And while others scoff, you can't help but admire the commitment. These people cared deeply about tulip symmetry. Like, cancel the wedding if the petals clash with the drapes, levels of care. As you stroll onward, a breeze lifts fallen petals into the air. They swirl like sleepy dancers. You pass by a stone water trough where an old man in robes is swishing bulbs gently in warm water. Pre-soak, he mutters. So they wake softly. You blink. Are these flowers people now? Further along, you overhear a tulip breeder ranting about the weather. Too much sun makes them arrogant, he says to a goose, which nods in apparent agreement. You don't question it. You end up in a garden where the soil has been imported from 5 different regions. We blend textures, the caretaker explains. Every layer of the bed tells a story. You try to act impressed. Truth is, it feels more like floral fan fiction. And yet, there's beauty here. Real, tangible beauty. The air smells of mint and warm stone. Somewhere, a fountain murmurs. A white tulip, veined with pale gold, leans slightly in the wind, as if bowing. You sit on a bench and let the scene settle over you like a silk blanket. But underneath this gentle madness, you begin to feel a tension. A sense that all this refinement, all this striving for the perfect bloom, is not entirely sustainable. One bulb fails and gardeners panic. One rainy week, and entire fortunes falter. It's like building an empire on whipped cream. Still, for now, the city's greatest minds are pouring their energy into tulip cultivation, and no one is stopping them. Why would they? There are worse things to obsess over, like swords, or taxes, or reality. You look up. The sun is starting to dip, casting golden light across the flower beds. A bell rings in the distance, a signal to cover the most precious tulips for the night. Silk tents are pulled over rows of blooms, not to keep them warm, just to preserve their mystery. You sigh. You've walked into a civilization where flowers have better bedtime routines than most people. The wind quiets, a final petal drops, and in the hush that follows, even the soil seems proud. Night thickens around you like velvet, the air cooler now, with just the gentlest hush of breeze rustling leaves overhead. You follow the scent of rosewood oil and flickering tallow to the edge of the palace district, where a hidden gate creaks open. Ahead lies something unexpected. The Tulip Festival of 10,000 Lamps, a celebration so extravagant, so delicate, and so gloriously unnecessary. It makes modern influencer parties look like PDA meetings. You step into a garden carved from moonlight. Every path is lined with lanterns, tiny flames dancing inside glass orbs, each one hand-painted with tulips. There are no crowds, no noise, just the soft padding of velvet shoes and the occasional whispered compliment about that particularly flirtatious shade of mauve. You walk slowly, as if any sudden motion might blow out the night. This isn't a party exactly, it's a ritual. Tulips in full bloom are on display like celebrities walking a red carpet. Guards stand like statues, but you catch one subtly sniffing a bloom when he thinks no one's looking. Respect. This secret festival was a staple of the later tulip era, hosted by the elite and performed mostly for themselves. Officially, it was about beauty. Unofficially, it was a flex. You own tulips? Cute. You lit 10,000 lamps to glow around them? Now you were somebody. Historians still argue whether these festivals were religious, political, or just glorified light shows with excellent catering. Regardless, the ambience? Impeccable. You stroll past a lily pond where reflections ripple with color. Flame, gold, sapphire. An oud player nearby plucks a tune so gentle. It feels like it's tracing patterns in your spine. A poet steps onto a low marble stage. His robe is embroidered with subtle tulip patterns. His turban slightly askew in that, "I'm deeply in touch with sadness" kind of way. He recites verses about longing and flower petals caught in silk veils. The crowd sighs. Someone discreetly dabs at their eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. You stare at a tulip and wonder if it's judging your emotional detachment. But then you get it. For a brief second, in the glow of the lanterns and the hush of string music, it clicks. The fragility, the luxury, the impermanence. These people are basking in the glory of something that refuses to last. A tulip festival is an ode to fleeting joy, the kind that feels all the richer because it must vanish. You meander toward a side path where couples whisper beneath flowering vines. Overhead, paper lanterns shaped like tulips sway. Each one was lit by hand earlier in the evening by palace attendants who have been trained for this moment all year. Their reward? Leftover figs and a 10-minute break. Down a side alley, a musician plays a ney flute so softly you wonder if he's summoning ghosts. A pair of children chase fireflies, laughing just loud enough to break the spell and then hush themselves again, as if even joy has a curfew here. And here comes a detail no one told you to expect. The water features. Dozens of narrow marble channels cut through the gardens, catching lamplight and reflecting it back in soft, shifting patterns. One pool is filled entirely with white petals, floating in spirals. Someone says they were hand-plucked from a single tree, which is both implausible and somehow entirely believable here. You pass by a perfumer's stall where guests are invited to dab custom-blended oils on their wrists, each inspired by a different tulip. You try one called Crimson Regret. It smells like cinnamon, rose, and bad decisions. You love it. Nearby, a table is laid with candied violets, pistachio pastries shaped like flower buds, and tiny glass bowls of pear juice. You don't eat. You observe. It feels appropriate. Then, the centerpiece. A central pavilion draped in silk and gold leaf. From within, a slow chant emerges. Soft, repetitive, laced with longing. It's not religious exactly. More poetic. A prayer not to a god, but to beauty itself. You can't understand the words, but the tone is clear. Thank you for this night. We know we cannot keep it. The elite file in and out with practiced serenity, pausing only to admire the rarest of tulips displayed on tall pedestals. There's the glass moon, a pale bloom so translucent it seems made of frost. The emperor's shadow, deep purple with flecks of silver. And, most dramatic of all, the widow, an inky black tulip with curled edges that looks like it's mourning its own perfection. Some say these festivals were a distraction, that while the empire decayed at its edges, its core danced in gardens, drunk on floral elegance. And maybe that's true. Maybe the candles were lit to keep people from looking into the dark. But also, maybe beauty is its own defense, a rebellion against decay. You listen to a group of women humming a folk tune in unison, their voices weaving like silk. A child dips their toes in a reflecting pool. A breeze tips over one lantern and a servant rushes forward to relight it, cradling the flame like it's alive. Then comes the moment everyone has waited for. From the upper terrace, with a fanfare of flutes and soft cymbals, the Grand Vizier himself steps forward and releases a single petal into the wind. This petal has been blessed, perfumed, and carried on a velvet cushion all evening. Where it lands, tradition says, next year's tulip gardens will bloom brightest. You hold your breath as it flutters downward, lands in the pond, and disappears. No one speaks. The music resumes. But the spell has changed. The softer now. The lamps burn lower. The air carries a hint of smoke and citrus. You begin to walk again, slower, your footsteps matching the hush of the evening. And as you pass beneath an archway woven with jasmine and starflowers, you think, maybe nothing really needs to last. Maybe it just needs to glow for a while. You wake, or maybe you never slept, and you're somewhere new again. Not a palace, not a garden, but a low, arched room that smells like ink, old parchment, and the faint, melancholy trace of sandalwood. This is where the words of the tulip era are made. You've stepped into the inner sanctum of the empire's artists, poets, and painters. People who, in an age of muskets and trade wars, chose to devote their entire existence to petals. You sit on the edge of a faded floor cushion, near a group of poets who look exactly as you'd expect. Wistful eyes, tired smiles, robes with too many layers, and the haunted look of men who've compared the same flower to the moon for 10 consecutive years. One of them sighs, puts down his pen, and mutters, "The tulip mocks me again." You'd think all this poetic gushing would have gone out of style, but no. The Ottomans adored their poets, especially those who could describe a tulip in ways that made grown men weep and women blush. And let's be honest, when you can rhyme pollen with sullen, you deserve a medal. Still, not all tulip art was high-minded. You walk across the room to where a miniature painter is hunched over a sheet of vellum the size of your hand. With a brush made of squirrel hair, because of course it is, he's painting a scene. A sultan handing a tulip to a blushing court lady. The flower is 3 times larger than her head. Perspective is optional, but it's undeniably charming. Historians still argue whether this creative explosion was truly organic or if artists were simply cashing in on court favoritism. After all, if the Sultan loves tulips, and your painting features tulips, well, suddenly your rent's paid. One rogue poet named Hafiz Lutfi even bragged that he wrote 400 tulip couplets in 1 week just to secure an audience with a vizier. That's productivity, Ottoman style. You stroll toward a corner alcove where a group of scribes is binding freshly inked books. One volume is nothing but a catalog of tulip varieties, complete with names like Sultan's Blush, Whispering Wine, and Accidental Miracle. You flip to a random page and read, Petals, 5, Color, Shifts from Apricot to Regret. Honestly, you'd buy that perfume. And while most of this artistry was confined to the court, tulip mania did trickle into the streets. You peer through the open shutters and see a boy hawking scrolls of printed tulip poems to passers-by. A street musician plays a tune called Dance of the Fading Bloom, and above a cobbler's door hangs a sign shaped like a tulip, painted with the words, Soft shoes for soft seasons. In fact, some artisans took tulip imagery way too far. One notable example, the famed silversmith Bahedin, who once created an entire coffee set in the shape of blooming tulips. The handles curled like stems. The sugar spoon resembled a stamen. The cups were impossible to hold without scalding your fingers, but still breathtaking. You duck into a shadowed room lit by green glass windows. There, a young woman sketches flowers with charcoal. Her drawings are less ornamental, more raw. The tulips aren't pristine. They're bruised, wilted, real. She says nothing, just nods at you and returns to her work. Later, she'll be banned from the palace for drawing decay. But tonight, she's still safe. And then the fringe. Always the fringe. There's the painter who tried to capture tulips from memory and accidentally created a series of nightmare flowers with human teeth. The poet who insisted that tulips only bloom properly when sung lullabies by eunuchs. The rumor of a shadow society, the Order of the Petal, that supposedly controlled tulip prices and organized underground bloom showdowns with whispered wagers and velvet-lined bulbs. Most of this, likely fiction. But when an entire empire agrees to live inside a metaphor, who's checking receipts? You wander past a fountain where young calligraphers dip their brushes. Each swirl of ink resembles a tulip stem, looping in hypnotic elegance. One master calls it the eternal curl, a style so delicate it's said to reflect the fleeting nature of beauty. Write it too slowly, he warns, and the line wilts. There's also a curious debate playing out across the empire. Should tulips be painted as they are, or as they feel? Literal versus emotional rendering. It's the great art school debate of 1720. Historians still argue which approach left a bigger legacy, but you're pretty sure the answer is whichever one involved more glitter. And glitter, yes, because toward the end of your stroll, you come upon the most luxurious manuscript yet. A treatise on tulips, handwritten in gold ink, bound in dyed leather, and studded with tiny emeralds. It smells like jasmine and ego. You flip to the last page. It reads, "The tulip is not a flower. It is a mirror. It shows us what we love, then dies to prove it was never ours." Deep, possibly nonsense, but poetic nonsense. You sit for a while beside a brass brazier where incense burns in coils. Around you, the air swirls with the smoke of amber, the rustle of pages, and the faint scraping of pen on paper. Someone plays a reed flute in the next room, notes drifting like falling petals. A cat, named Lael of course, slinks across the cushions and curls up at your feet. There's peace in this space, not from silence but from focus. Everyone here is doing something that doesn't matter, and somehow that makes it matter more. Outside, you can hear the distant clink of lanterns being taken down. The garden festivities have ended. But here, in this quiet room of artists and dreamers, the night is still in bloom. You step back into the morning light, blinking at the sudden change. The city hums around you, not with joy this time, but with calculation. Traders shout prices. Couriers dart through alleys with scrolls tucked under their arms. You're in the heart of the Ottoman Bazaar district, and the tulip has now fully transitioned from poetry to product. Yes, welcome to tulip capitalism, where flowers become fortune, and your neighbor just mortgaged his house for a bulb. You stroll through narrow lanes where flower stalls outnumber food stalls, and every vendor swears their bulb blooms, like the first kiss of spring on a silver mirror. Sure, Mehmet, that's the third time you've said that this morning. Here, tulips aren't just admired, they're traded. Like spices, like gold, like secrets. A silk-draped merchant waves you over, grinning with all the serenity of a man who's just sold a bulb for the price of a donkey. He opens a lacquered chest to reveal 5 fat tulip bulbs, nestled in wool like treasure. "From Edirne," he whispers. "Flames on snow." You nod, not because you understand, but because everyone else seems very into this metaphor. Historians still argue whether this blossoming economy was genuinely sustainable or just a really polite Ponzi scheme. Because here's the thing. These tulips haven't even bloomed yet. People are buying future blooms. Sight unseen. Some of these bulbs won't flower for a year. Others, maybe never. But the idea of the bloom is intoxicating. You trail behind a buyer pacing nervously outside a flower broker's shop. He's just paid half a year's wages for a bulb called Golden Breathe. He clutches the receipt like a love letter. Inside, a scribe records the transaction in a ledger thick enough to use as a doorstop. You peek in. Rows of tulip names, prices, buyers. This part florist, part stock market, part emotional support journal. The government, of course, gets involved. New regulations are issued. Maximum prices are posted. There are even whispers of bulb taxation. But the fever doesn't break. If anything, rules make the tulips seem even more precious. People start using coded language to trade. One popular phrase, "The nightingale has found its spring." Translation, "A bulb just sold for way too much." And yes, there's fraud. You pass a trial in session outside a local mosque. A man stands accused of painting white stripes on a plain red bulb to mimic the sought-after blood swan variety. His defense? "The tulip asked me to." The judge sighs. You follow a woman into a private tea house that's actually a front for bulb auctions. No yelling here, just raised eyebrows and slow sips of mint tea. A bulb called Empress Whisper goes for the price of a small herd of goats. Nobody claps. They just nod approvingly, like art collectors acknowledging a particularly bold brushstroke. Outside, you catch a glimpse of a paper being passed discreetly between 2 noblemen. It's a futures contract. The buyer will pay 3 gold pieces now, and another 10 once the tulip blooms next spring. If it doesn't bloom, no refund. If it blooms poorly, tough luck. If it blooms spectacularly, congratulations, you're rich. In flower, this tulip trade isn't just local. You overhear conversations about Dutch varieties, Persian soils, even Venetian silk-wrapped bulbs smuggled overland. International tulip envy is real and slightly exhausting. In a darkened booth near the end of the market, you stumble upon a curious sight, a shrine-like display of withered tulips. Behind it, an old man with ink-stained hands and very few teeth. Failed investments, he says, tapping the glass. Each one worth a horse once. You nod solemnly. Even the dead tulips get memorialized here. But there's also absurdity. A popular coffee house holds tulip-themed games. Spin the bulb. Guess the bloom color. Recite a tulip poem from memory. Get a free drink. One man attempts to rhyme pistol with thistle and gets booed into oblivion. Tough crowd. You sit for a while at a corner table with a group of middle-class artisans. They're discussing the market like seasoned economists. The velvet lion is overvalued. One grumbles. I told you to go with Sultan's Echo. Another just stares into his cup. I sold my donkey, he mutters. No one replies. Among the quirkier developments, the tulip dowry. Some families begin using tulip bulbs instead of gold for marriage contracts. One well-documented case involves a groom's family offering 20 bulbs of amber silence to the bride's family. 2 of the bulbs turned out to be onions. The marriage lasted 6 weeks. You wander into a quiet courtyard where a trio of accountants is calculating estimated bloom values on wooden abacuses. Nearby, a banker offers loans against tulip collateral. His sign reads, "In bulbs we trust." You sit on a bench and quietly lose faith in economic systems. And yet, beneath the satire, there's a kind of purity to it. People are investing in something beautiful, something that grows, that reminds them spring is coming. Is that really worse than, say, stocks in warships? Still, the tension is building. You can feel it in the air. Tulip prices are climbing to absurd heights. One bulb reportedly sold for the cost of a small vineyard. Another came with a house and 2 servants. People are whispering, worrying. What if they stop blooming? What if they fall out of fashion? What if we were wrong? But for now, the market roars. And somewhere, far from the frenzy, in a modest garden behind a quiet home, a single tulip opens, and no one is there to see it. You slip away from the bustling market before your wallet spontaneously combusts from second-hand speculation and wander into a quieter neighborhood tucked between the hills of Istanbul. Here, there's a different energy in the air. Not the feverish whisper of trade, but the still, reverent hum of obsession. You're in the quarter of the broken tulip. Yes, broken. The very word sounds like something sad and wilted. But here, it's the ultimate compliment. You find yourself face to face with what might be the most irrational love story in botany. The empire's romance with a flower that's technically sick. You shuffle into a garden cloaked in gauze curtains. Inside, a single tulip stands beneath a parasol. Yes, a real fabric parasol. Its petals streaked with dramatic flashes of flame-like patterns. This is what they call Rembrandting, or the break. It's not natural. It's caused by a virus. A literal infection in the bulb that mutates its pigment, creating vivid feathering or flames. And yet, they love it. In fact, they prize it above all others. Healthy tulip? Cute, says a noblewoman inspecting her flower bed. But a broken tulip? Divine. She gestures to a crimson bloom slashed with ivory lightning bolts. This one made a vizier cry. Historians still argue whether Ottoman horticulturalists knew the broken tulip was infected or if they saw the unpredictable streaks as divine intervention. Either way, they didn't care. They wanted them, needed them, paid fortunes for them. There's even a whispered tale of a merchant who intentionally spread the virus to create more beauties, only to die mysteriously 2 weeks later, possibly from bulb rot, possibly from jealous rivals. No one asked too many questions. You approach a gathering of scholars beneath a cedar pergola. They're debating the break like theologians. Is it a flaw or a gift? One asks. Is imperfection not the truest form of beauty? Another offers. A third just sighs and cradles a bulb in his palm like a newborn kitten. And here's where it gets really surreal. They started naming these broken tulips like minor deities. Silver Flame, Night Pearl, Whisper's End, each one with its own origin story, price history, and admirers. There was even a registry maintained by the palace where broken tulips were listed like royal titles. You peek at one entry, Frosted Soul seen once in 1721. Location unknown, possibly mythical. Artists adored the broken tulip. You step into a studio where miniaturists paint detailed portraits of flowers they've never even seen in person, working only from rumor and jealous descriptions. One is creating a series called The Seven Streaked Spirits, which sounds more like a superhero team than a horticultural set, but the detail is exquisite. Poets were even worse. One man composed an 88-verse saga in which a broken tulip seduces the moon, gets rejected, and dies gloriously in a bed of dew. You read stanza 46 and have no idea what's happening, but you're strangely moved. Of course, this obsession created some dark corners. In hidden corners of the city, break brokers began offering treatments, experimental soil mixes, moonlight exposure rituals, even whispered incantations, to coax a break from otherwise boring blooms. Some methods worked. Most ruined entire gardens. But like all beauty cults, reason was no longer welcome. You pass a modest house with a velvet rope blocking the entrance to a single bloom. The owner, a quiet elderly man with wild eyebrows and garden-soiled fingernails, guards it like it's a crown jewel. He tells you its name is Dream Rupture, and that it only opens when the wind blows east and the call to prayer overlaps with birdsong. You don't ask questions. You just nod slowly and back away. Even the palace got involved. One imperial edict declared that any gardener who produced a broken tulip of 7 distinct streaks would receive a pouch of gold and a new house. The reward was never claimed, but not for lack of trying. One woman spent 12 years in isolation with her bulbs, talking to them, reading them poems, sleeping near them for warmth. Her only visitor was a cat named Lael. She died tulipless but wildly beloved in local legend. The broken tulip even sparked metaphysical debates. Was it proof of divine will? A sign that even beauty must suffer? Or was it, more simply, a mirror of the empire itself, elegant, fading, glorious in its imperfections? You walk through a nighttime garden filled only with broken tulips. They don't bloom in unison. Some shiver open early. Others hold their secrets until the very last day of spring. The patterns aren't symmetrical. Some are jagged like scars, others soft like ink dropped in milk. Each one is its own miniature rebellion against order. And as you breathe in the perfume of a field half-mad with color and contradiction, you can't help but admire the empire's commitment. They didn't want flowers that lasted, or behaved, or obeyed the rules of botany. They wanted something that danced on the edge of ruin and called it divine. You pause before one final tulip, jet black, streaked with sunset pink, barely open. It's called Quiet Catastrophe. You smile, because honestly, that's the whole empire right there. The scent of last night's broken tulips still lingers in your memory as you step into the early sunlight and find yourself in an entirely different kind of battlefield. One paved not with blood and dust, but with hedgerows, marble fountains, and outrageously competitive gardening. This is the Great Garden Arms Race, and yes, you're about to witness noble households out-tuliping each other like it's a cold war of blossoms. You enter through a gilded gate that creaks dramatically for no reason other than aesthetics. Before you stretches an estate garden the size of a football field. If that field were divided into symmetrical floral quadrants, each one whispering, "I have more money than you." You're in the realm of the Ottoman elite, where prestige is measured not in titles or horses, but in petal symmetry and irrigation systems. At first, you think you're imagining things. A butler casually adjusting the angle of a tulip to make sure it catches the morning sun? A gardener polishing individual leaves with a damp cloth? But no, this is standard procedure. Each garden you pass is more dramatic than the last. One features a miniature canal system built just to reflect the tulips upside down in perfect, shimmering symmetry. Another includes a trained parrot that recites tulip poetry as you stroll through. Your colors shame the ruby, it croaks. Also, squawk. You sidestep politely around a servant releasing butterflies from a woven cage. Because what good are flowers without fluttering, symbolic insects? The butterflies are hired. A voice behind you mutters. You turn to see a rival noble inspecting the spectacle with thinly veiled contempt. They're trained to land only on the brightest blooms. It's cheating, really? Historians still argue whether this garden rivalry genuinely influenced the Ottoman upper class or was just a symptom of extreme boredom. Either way, the competition was real. Nobles invested fortunes into designing elaborate garden layouts, hiring architects, philosophers, astrologers, even dancers, to create floral experiences that would crush their enemies in the most passive-aggressive way possible. You stroll through one particularly extravagant estate where the garden is built in tiers, each one representing a level of paradise as described in Sufi mysticism. A tour guide in a lavender robe explains, the top tier blooms only at twilight. It reflects divine melancholy. You nod, as if this makes perfect sense. Then there's the infamous House of Shalebi, known across Istanbul for winning the Imperial Tulip Garden competition 3 years in a row. You enter through an archway where every stone is inlaid with tiny tulip mosaics. Inside, perfection. The scent of rose, mint, and orange blossom wraps around you like silk. There are gazebos covered in flowering vines, water clocks, and even trained birds that whistle the opening notes of love songs. You pass a group of judges in stiff robes measuring petal angles with golden calipers. One frowns. 3 degrees too proud, he mutters, pointing at a coral bloom. Arrogant. Replant it. A gardener bows in shame. But not all gardens are so serene. At one estate, you find an elaborate floral maze rumored to have caused 4 guests to faint from sun exposure and one to declare, I have found God in a tulip, and he is smug. The host had it paved over immediately. Can't have guests finding divinity before dessert. In the corner of another estate, a pavilion boasts the first ever musical fountain, synchronized to tulip growth cycles. Water dances in time with the gentle blooming of purple and yellow hybrids. A plaque reads, commissioned by Lady Ice after a vivid dream involving flying fish and her grandmother's perfume. You begin to notice certain patterns. The wealthier the estate, the fewer the actual guests. These gardens aren't for strolling, they're statements. Conversations are hushed. Eyes scan the beds like inspectors. Did he use Dutch soil? No, Persian gravel under local loam. Bold choice. Every gardener becomes both artist and spy. There are rumors that the Sultan himself used to send anonymous scouts to observe rival gardens. If a noble was found using a tulip variety too similar to the imperial ones, they might be gently asked to reconsider their hobby. One man reportedly repainted his entire greenhouse after such a visit. The paint was scented, of course. But then, a surprise. You stumble upon a modest estate, tucked into a quiet corner. No fountains, no flamingos, just rows of tulips, arranged by bloom time, not color. A boy sits on a wooden stool reading a poetry book aloud to the flowers. His mother tends the soil in silence. And yet, the moment feels richer than all the marble statues you've passed. Not all greatness is loud. You ask around and learn this family once produced a broken tulip that stunned the palace. But instead of selling it, they quietly reburied the bulb. It belonged to the earth, the boy says, not to gold. You consider starting a slow clap, but this doesn't seem like the place. Still, most nobles weren't so humble. Garden theft was a genuine issue. Rival servants bribed gardeners to smuggle bulbs. Some even disguised themselves as traveling priests to sneak into estates and sketch layouts. One woman lost her entire east wing display to a tulip burglary that included 5 rare cultivars and 3 terracotta angels. Garden design books also exploded during this time. You leaf through one in a merchant's shop, hand-illustrated diagrams showing how to arrange tulips by emotion. One spread is titled Melancholy in mauve. Another simply says for rival weddings and shows a bed of spiky, blood-red blooms. And because nothing is complete without a little drama, there were duels. Yes, actual duels. Not with swords, of course. With pruning shears. One legendary showdown between two garden architects was witnessed by 30 guests and ended with a dramatic disqualification when someone accused the other of fertilizing with goat dung. Scandalous. But as you make your way back toward the palace gate, the sun begins to dip again, casting long shadows across the floral battlefields. The garden's quiet. Lanterns flicker to life. Servants begin covering blooms with lace veils, like tucking children in for sleep. And you realize it was never about the tulips. Not really. It was about being seen, remembered, revered. A way to prove, without words, that your beauty was more beautiful than theirs. You step into the evening air, heart softened by the perfume of vanity and violets, and wonder what tomorrow's competition will look like. You wake, metaphorically, to the soft echo of court music and the unmistakable scent of rose attar, which means one thing. You've walked straight into the Ottoman fashion show, or more precisely, into the most extravagantly dressed, wildly mustachioed garden party in early 18th century Istanbul. The era of tulip obsession wasn't just about flowers, after all. It was also a runway, and you, lucky sleeper, have front-row access to the most unnecessary parade of embroidered jackets and bejeweled footwear this side of the Bosporus. You duck into a courtyard bustling with activity. Dignitaries and socialites glide past in layers of silk so thick you wonder how they remain upright. Caftans gleam with thread of gold embroidery, each with a tulip pattern so detailed you suspect a team of monks worked on them for months. One man's belt buckle alone could fund a small military campaign. You try not to stare, but it's hard when someone's headdress has actual sapphires spelling out the word grace. And then you see it, a mustache that defies physics. Its owner, a tall nobleman in slippers embroidered with peacock feathers, notices your gaze and smiles proudly. 3 hours a day, he says, twirling one end. I oil it with fig milk and patience. You offer a respectful nod. Fashion is war, and this man is clearly a general. Historians still argue whether the outrageous dress of this time was truly inspired by tulip culture or just a byproduct of wealth and boredom. But there's no denying it. Tulips infiltrated the wardrobe. Tunics featured tulip necklines. Slippers were curled at the toe and embroidered with tiny petals. Even turbans had floral motifs stitched into their folds, just in case someone forgot you were fabulously obsessed. You pass a mirror placed discreetly behind a column. It's used for quick checks before entering the grand salon, where tonight's soiree is hosted. A young courtier, no older than 20, is adjusting his cloak. He mutters under his breath, "Too much lavender. I look like a sofa." A servant discreetly switches his sash. Crisis averted. At these gatherings, appearances weren't optional, they were currency. Every color, every thread, every bloom tucked behind an ear spoke volumes. You see a woman in a gown of pale silver, her tulip brooch matching exactly the shade of her fan. Another man wears a ring with a tiny pink bloom sealed in glass. He whispers proudly that it's from a failed garden, but its memory still shines. You enter the salon, and it is a visual thunderstorm. Chandeliers drip with crystals, reflecting candlelight across tapestries that depict entire floral fables. A trio of musicians plays instruments shaped like flowers. A lute with a rose carved into its base, a ney flute with tulip-shaped holes, and a tambourine etched with petals. In the center, nobles gather in a loose circle, not dancing, not debating, posing. This is what they call the stance of stillness, where attendees casually lean near flowers as if caught mid-thought. Judges wander the room, pretending to be wine attendants but actually rating the outfits. Somewhere, a servant records notes like, "Excellent brocade work, tragic sandals." You eavesdrop on a conversation that can only be described as aggressively polite. "Darling," says one matron, "your tulip print veil is exquisite." The younger woman beams. "It was blessed by the gardener himself." The matron smiles with narrowed eyes. "Of course, mine is blessed by the Grand Vizier." Touché. The strange thing? There's sincerity here. These people aren't just dressing up for vanity, they believe in beauty. They see elegance as virtue. A well-folded robe reflects inner harmony. A carefully trimmed beard reveals self-discipline. Even a tulip-shaped earring symbolizes devotion to ephemeral things. You begin to understand. Fashion isn't the distraction. It's the ritual. One eccentric detail stands out: mustache medallions. These are small, tulip-shaped charms clipped into mustaches during formal events. Each one is slightly scented: rose for wisdom, clove for strength, sandalwood for passion. A man with 3 medallions is either revered or ridiculed, depending on the room. Tonight, you see a man with 5. People pretend not to notice. They absolutely notice. Then come the entertainers. A dancer enters, her veil studded with glass tulips that shimmer with every movement. She doesn't perform a traditional dance. No, she blooms. Every turn mimics a petal unfurling, every gesture a breeze brushing past a blossom. By the end, she kneels beneath a real tulip suspended in a cage of candlelight. No one claps. They just exhale, gently, collectively, reverently. You move into a smaller drawing room where the elite exchange gifts. Naturally, these are not normal gifts. One man presents his rival with a vial of perfume labeled Tears of the Tulip, supposedly distilled from flowers grown during a solar eclipse. Another offers a scroll with fashion predictions for the next bloom cycle. Greens will die, he intones. Silvers will rise. And then, the crown jewel. A cloak lined with fabric woven to reflect the color of the rare, midnight orchid, tulip. It shimmers between plum and smoke depending on the light. The recipient, a young painter who once captured a fading bloom so perfectly the Sultan asked if he'd painted it before or after its death. The painter never answered. Not all is soft. You overhear a snub. A woman complimenting another's kaftan for its bravery. A man's tulip cravat is said to smell slightly of soup. The tension is scented and silken. And yet, under the layers of lace and gold, something gentle pulses. An unspoken agreement that beauty, even ridiculous, overpriced, feather-clad beauty, is worth preserving. That even if the empire crumbles, someone will remember the man with the glass slippers shaped like tulip bulbs. As the night deepens, the candles dim. People recline on cushions, sipping sherbet and murmuring stories. One man recounts a dream where he walked through a field of tulips, and each one whispered a secret from his childhood. Another claims he once saw a tulip fold itself shut upon hearing bad poetry. That one gets a laugh. You step outside into the cool night. Somewhere, a harp plays the final notes of a melody called The Bloom That Waited. You feel the quiet pride of a culture that dressed itself not for power, but for presence. And as you descend the marble steps, the last thing you see is a tulip-shaped slipper, left forgotten beneath a bench. The lamps from the fashion soiree still flicker in the distance as you move through the narrow backstreets of Istanbul, where the cobblestones feel older, the air cooler, and the tulips, curiously, more nervous. This is the world behind the world. The alleyways of imported bulbs and quiet smuggling, where tulips travel not with fanfare, but in the shadows. You find yourself following a cart covered in a ragged burlap sheet. The man guiding it whistles off-key and glances behind him too often to be innocent. You stay a polite distance away. Beneath the burlap, not weapons, not gold, just bulbs. Fat, muddy, utterly illegal tulip bulbs. You've entered the black market of Ottoman floriculture. Because when tulips became treasures, they also became contraband. Customs agents couldn't keep up. Smuggling operations bloomed like, well, tulips. Some disguised bulbs as potatoes. Others packed them in silk rolls and labeled them prayer items. One enterprising young man hollowed out loaves of bread, tucked bulbs inside, and got them through checkpoints with a smile and a sandwich. Historians still argue how widespread tulip smuggling really was. Some believe it was a niche problem. Others claim there were entire underground tulip cartels. What's certain is that bulbs moved from Persia, from the Netherlands, even from Venice, each wrapped carefully, like something sacred. You slip into a low-ceilinged warehouse near the docks. The smell is musty. Damp earth, tobacco, a little fear. Crates line the walls. On the lid of one, "Do not water." In another, bulbs nested in sawdust, each tagged with a made-up name. Midnight Rose, Sultan's Echo, the Secret Wink. Names meant to disguise their real, pricier identities. A man in a red sash nods toward you. Looking for something unique? He says. You decline politely. You're just here for the tour. Nearby, a woman packs a bulb into a hollowed-out book titled Philosophy of Humility. Irony sold separately. She grins. Customs doesn't read philosophy, she says, tying it shut. You walk through this hush-hush world where flower trafficking looks eerily like an art gallery. The walls are lined with sketches of tulips. Real, exaggerated, imaginary. Some collectors even paid for tulip forgeries. Bulbs painted with dye or rubbed with crushed berries to mimic the broken effect. If it fooled a buyer long enough to make the sale, that was considered fair play. And the risks? Oh, they were real. One bulb, just one, could cost more than a horse or a dowry, or, in a particularly dramatic case, a small ferryboat. People died over bulbs. One merchant was caught swapping forged tulips with Dutch bulbs and was sentenced to 30 lashes. Though he famously smiled through all of them and said, "But mine still bloomed better." You head into the countryside now, following a quiet road that tulip smugglers often used to ferry rare flowers into noble estates. The wagons move by night. Their wheels are padded with rags to muffle sound. At each checkpoint, a coded phrase, "I carry the spring." The response, "Then let it bloom." You stop at a small inn where smugglers once exchanged information. Inside, an old woman pours tea and tells you stories without ever looking up from her embroidery. One tale is about a man who hid bulbs inside prayer beads. Another swore his beard was stuffed with moss and tulips. No one believed him until he sneezed and bloomed. Of course, not all of this was criminal in the usual sense. Some smugglers were gardeners themselves. Men and women desperate to bring new beauty into the empire, bypassing taxes and permissions that strangled creativity. It wasn't theft, says the innkeeper. It was devotion, to color, to life. Still, some got greedy. There were tulip heists. One noble's garden was stripped overnight, each bulb replaced with a rock of similar size. A week later, he wept beside an empty bloom bed and reportedly whispered, "Even the soil betrayed me." Meanwhile, the government tried to crack down. Imperial edicts were issued. No tulip bulbs may cross the Bosporus after sunset. All bulbs must be registered with the Office of Botanical Purity. Inspectors were appointed. They wore green sashes and carried notebooks. Some took bribes. Others took notes. One famously shut down an entire district for overwhelming fragrance. You find a record of a failed sting operation. 2 janissaries hiding in a cart of hay, waiting to catch a smuggler. The smuggler never showed. But the tulips in the hay, they bloomed, confusing the soldiers and attracting 30 bees. One got stung. The operation was not repeated. There was even talk of planting trap gardens. Beds of impossibly beautiful tulips meant to lure greedy buyers, only to arrest them mid-swoon. One such garden reportedly caused 7 engagements, 2 duels, and an accidental poetry club. You turn down a dusty path and arrive at a tiny shrine built not to a saint, but to a tulip. A smuggler once buried a rare broken bulb here after deciding it was too beautiful for this world. Each spring, villagers say a single streaked bloom appears. No one dares pick it. The sun begins to dip, casting long shadows across fields of legal and illegal blooms alike. You pass a small boy carrying a bulb in a handkerchief. He holds it like treasure. Maybe it is. Maybe he doesn't even know what kind it is. Maybe that's the point. And as you watch him disappear down the hill, you wonder, was this a crime? Or was it a quiet kind of love? The lamps from the fashion soiree still flicker in the distance as you move through the narrow backstreets of Istanbul, where the cobblestones feel older, the air cooler, and the tulips, curiously, more nervous. This is the world behind the world. The alleyways of imported bulbs and quiet smuggling, where tulips travel not with fanfare, but in the shadows. You find yourself following a cart covered in a ragged burlap sheet. The man guiding it whistles off-key and glances behind him too often to be innocent. You stay a polite distance away. Beneath the burlap, not weapons, not gold, just bulbs. Fat, muddy, utterly illegal tulip bulbs. You've entered the black market of Ottoman floriculture. Because when tulips became treasures, they also became contraband. Customs agents couldn't keep up. Smuggling operations bloomed like, well, tulips. Some disguised bulbs as potatoes. Others packed them in silk rolls and labeled them prayer items. One enterprising young man hollowed out loaves of bread, tucked bulbs inside, and got them through checkpoints with a smile and a sandwich. Historians still argue how widespread tulip smuggling really was. Some believe it was a niche problem. Others claim there were entire underground tulip cartels. What's certain is that bulbs moved from Persia, from the Netherlands, even from Venice, each wrapped carefully, like something sacred. You slip into a low-ceilinged warehouse near the docks. The smell is musty. Damp earth, tobacco, a little fear. Crates line the walls. On the lid of one, "Do not water." In another, bulbs nested in sawdust, each tagged with a made-up name. Midnight Rose, Sultan's Echo, the Secret Wink. Names meant to disguise their real, pricier identities. A man in a red sash nods toward you. "Looking for something unique?" he says. You decline politely. You're just here for the tour. Nearby, a woman packs a bulb into a hollowed-out book titled Philosophy of Humility. Irony sold separately. She grins. "Customs doesn't read philosophy," she says, tying it shut. You walk through this hush-hush world where flower trafficking looks eerily like an art gallery. The walls are lined with sketches of tulips. Real, exaggerated, imaginary. Some collectors even paid for tulip forgeries. Bulbs painted with dye or rubbed with crushed berries to mimic the broken effect. If it fooled a buyer long enough to make the sale, that was considered fair play. And the risks? Oh, they were real. One bulb, just one, could cost more than a horse or a dowry, or, in a particularly dramatic case, a small ferryboat. People died over bulbs. One merchant was caught swapping forged tulips with Dutch bulbs and was sentenced to 30 lashes. Though he famously smiled through all of them and said, "But mine still bloomed better." You head into the countryside now, following a quiet road that tulip smugglers often used to ferry rare flowers into noble estates. The wagons move by night. Their wheels are padded with rags to muffle sound. At each checkpoint, a coded phrase, "I carry the spring." The response, "Then let it bloom." You stop at a small inn where smugglers once exchanged information. Inside, an old woman pours tea and tells you stories without ever looking up from her embroidery. One tale is about a man who hid bulbs inside prayer beads. Another swore his beard was stuffed with moss and tulips. No one believed him until he sneezed and bloomed. Of course, not all of this was criminal in the usual sense. Some smugglers were gardeners themselves. Men and women desperate to bring new beauty into the empire, bypassing taxes and permissions that strangled creativity. It wasn't theft, says the innkeeper. It was devotion, to color, to life. Still, some got greedy. There were tulip heists. One noble's garden was stripped overnight, each bulb replaced with a rock of similar size. A week later, he wept beside an empty bloom bed and reportedly whispered, "Even the soil betrayed me." Meanwhile, the government tried to crack down. Imperial edicts were issued. No tulip bulbs may cross the Bosporus after sunset. All bulbs must be registered with the Office of Botanical Purity. Inspectors were appointed. They wore green sashes and carried notebooks. Some took bribes. Others took notes. One famously shut down an entire district for overwhelming fragrance. You find a record of a failed sting operation. 2 janissaries hiding in a cart of hay, waiting to catch a smuggler. The smuggler never showed. But the tulips in the hay, they bloomed, confusing the soldiers and attracting 30 bees. One got stung. The operation was not repeated. There was even talk of planting trap gardens. Beds of impossibly beautiful tulips meant to lure greedy buyers, only to arrest them mid-swoon. One such garden reportedly caused 7 engagements, 2 duels, and an accidental poetry club. You turn down a dusty path and arrive at a tiny shrine built not to a saint, but to a tulip. A smuggler once buried a rare broken bulb here after deciding it was too beautiful for this world. Each spring, villagers say a single streaked bloom appears. No one dares pick it. The sun begins to dip. casting long shadows across fields of legal and illegal blooms alike. You pass a small boy carrying a bulb in a handkerchief. He holds it like treasure. Maybe it is. Maybe he doesn't even know what kind it is. Maybe that's the point. And as you watch him disappear down the hill, you wonder, was this a crime? Or was it a quiet kind of love? You rise the next morning to a strange stillness. The air tastes different. The petals seem brittle. You sense it before you even step into the main avenue. Something has wilted, not just in the gardens, but in the very soul of the empire. You are walking into the slow-motion collapse of petal-based sanity. At first, the signs are subtle. A merchant lowers his prices on the once legendary Sultan's flame. A noblewoman leaves a bulb unattended at the corner of a fountain. Unthinkable just weeks ago. Rumors flutter like wind-tossed blossoms. Someone bought a broken tulip that failed to bloom. A famed breeder's prize garden succumbed to mold. The market is quiet, and that's terrifying. You slip into the central bazaar, where once the sound of bulb brokers haggling created a melody of commerce. Today, the stalls are open, but the tulips lie limp in their boxes, like they too sense the shift. One seller mutters to no one, "They're just flowers." He flinches, as if struck by his own blasphemy. Historians still argue about the tipping point. Was it a mass crop failure? A series of buyer defaults? Did a scandal spark distrust? One theory posits that a rogue gardener confessed, on his deathbed of course, that he'd been dyeing bulbs for years, and the confession spread like wildfire. Another theory blames the Dutch for flooding the market with cheaper bulbs. Others whisper it was divine retribution for valuing petals above prayers. Whatever the truth, the result is clear. The bloom has burst. You follow a man storming out of a tea house, clutching a contract in one hand and a wilted tulip in the other. He screams at the heavens, "You were supposed to be eternal." Then he trips on his own robe. It's all very tragic, but also a little comedic. Back in the palace, things aren't faring much better. The imperial ledgers once filled with tulip orders now gather dust. Gardeners wander the courts with nothing to do. The Grand Vizier, once the high priest of petal aesthetics, reportedly refuses to say the word tulip altogether. He now refers to them only as the former joy. A servant tells you the Sultan hasn't entered his garden in a month. "He just stares at the tapestries now," she whispers. "The ones with the glowing petals. He won't even look at the real ones." You walk the now empty paths of the once great garden festival grounds. The oil lamps are unlit. The fountains run sluggish. A child kicks a dried-up bloom into a pond, and the ripples feel like an elegy. Then comes the worst part, the burnings. You hear of one noble who, in a dramatic fit of betrayal, ordered his entire collection of bulbs destroyed. Servants carted out crates of tulips and fed them into a courtyard bonfire. Neighbors cried. Gardeners wept. The man reportedly shouted, "Let beauty be ash," before fainting from smoke inhalation. Another household tried to plant vegetables instead. Practical crops, they said, but their cabbage plot got trampled by deer. Nature has opinions, but it's not all fire and panic. There's also denial. You pass a wealthy estate still hosting evening parties with flower-themed masks and candlelit dances. The guests speak only in floral metaphors. The petal still curves, one insists. The soil still sings. You watch as a woman gestures gracefully with a glass of pomegranate wine and accidentally lights her tulip-shaped sleeve on fire. No one reacts. They just keep dancing. In the poorer quarters, resentment bubbles. "While they bought flowers, we sold our shoes," mutters one baker, slapping dough harder than necessary. A fishmonger adds, "They counted petals while we counted crumbs." The tulip, once a unifier of aesthetic delight, is now a symbol of class fracture. A scented scapegoat. There are attempts to revive the craze. One pamphlet circulates claiming tulips possess medicinal properties. Boil them for spiritual clarity. Another claims they enhance dreams. A man sets up a tulip energy booth, promising to align your life through flower vibrations. No one buys it, not even the booth. You walk through a square where once an auction for a rare bulb drew crowds that spilled into the alleys. Today, a solitary musician plays a sad tune called Petals in Autumn. The melody sounds like something falling in slow motion. And yet, beneath all this, some linger. Quiet tulip lovers who tend their blooms not for profit or praise, but for peace. A widow kneels beside her garden each morning, whispering the names of her flowers like prayers. A blind gardener touches petals with reverent fingers, saying, "I can't see them, but they remember me." You sit by a crumbling wall where tulips bloom wild, uncultivated, undisturbed. No labels, no parasols, just color and silence. One is broken, red streaked with white, and for a moment you swear it leans toward you, as if sharing a secret. Or an apology. And that's when it dawns on you. The tulip craze didn't collapse because beauty failed. It collapsed because people forgot why they loved beauty to begin with. They tried to own it, price it, trade it, turn it into gold. But beauty doesn't work like that. It isn't a contract. It's a moment, a glimpse, a gasp in springtime. You watch the wind carry a petal across the square. No one chases it. No one bids on it. It just floats. And somehow that feels like healing. You drift now into the undercurrent of unrest, the part of the story that no garden catalog dares to mention. The bloom has withered, yes, but something else has taken root. Something sharper, louder, more dangerous. You step carefully into the smoke-hazed streets of 1730 Istanbul, where tulips are no longer merely out of fashion. They're being blamed. This is the Patrona Halil revolt, and while historians still argue how much of it was really about tulips, one thing is clear: petals became powder kegs. You follow the growing murmur of a crowd toward the city square. It's early autumn, but the air feels like storm season. The lanterns have not been lit. The flowers have been pulled up. Someone has chalked the words, "Lail Yeti," enough tulips, on the mosque wall. You'd think no revolution could start with a flower. But this one kind of did. Patrona Halil, a former janissary and bathhouse worker, isn't a man you'd expect to lead a rebellion. But he's angry, and his anger finds a chorus in the working class, in soldiers who feel mocked by floating festivals, and in shopkeepers who sold their goods for bulbs now worth nothing. The tulip, once a symbol of imperial elegance, has become a synecdoche for everything wrong with the world. Excess, indulgence, frivolity. You pass a merchant shouting, "While we starved, they bathed their tulips in rosewater." Someone throws a withered bloom onto the street and stomps on it. Symbolism is not subtle here. You round a corner and nearly trip over a broken cart, used to haul wood, now abandoned mid-delivery. A child sits beside it, clutching a dried tulip like a talisman. He doesn't speak, but his eyes say, "What happened to the magic?" The palace, meanwhile, is in denial. Ahmed III reportedly still strolls the lesser gardens, pretending the revolution is a strong breeze that will pass. The Grand Vizier holds a dinner party and asks guests to wear mood-enhancing colors. The guards are less relaxed. They've doubled patrols, blocked bridges, switched from decorative lances to actual swords. You walk through a courtyard just in time to see a guard rip tulip motifs off a tapestry. They fall like snow. One lands at your feet. You leave it there. On the morning of the uprising, you stand among the crowd gathered in front of the Topkapi Palace gates. The chants begin low. Bread, not blooms. Justice, not gardens. We want sultans, not stylists. It escalates with startling speed. Soon the gates rattle. Smoke rises from a burning garden just beyond the wall. You hear a man cry out, "They spent silver on petals and left our streets dark." Someone throws a flower pot. Then another. It hits a guard. That's the moment the guards stop pretending this is a poetry reading. The clash is sudden and sharp. You duck into an alley as swords ring out. Somewhere, someone is still trying to sell bulbs, half price for rebels, before being chased off by a broom-wielding grandmother. And then, it happens. The gates break. Patrona Halil enters the palace not as a conqueror, but as a reckoning. His men rip down the remaining floral tapestries. They smash flower vases. One soldier stands on a bench and declares, Let no man wear a tulip again. A court musician faints. Sultan Ahmed III, caught in the quiet between disbelief and exile, does not resist. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he saw it coming, beauty turning brittle, devotion turning to dust. He abdicates within days. The gardens are closed. The Grand Vizier disappears, possibly into exile, possibly into a tulip crate bound for the coast. No one knows for sure. You walk through the palace halls afterward. The silence is thick. Rooms that once echoed with poetry and lute songs now creak under the weight of broken ceramics. A single painting remains on the wall. A tulip, half-finished. The artist never came back. And yet, even among the fire and fury, not all rebels hated tulips. Some said, "We do not despise the flower, only what it blinded us to." You hear a woman mutter as she sweeps the courtyard. It wasn't the bloom, it was the bloom's price. The new regime doesn't outlaw tulips entirely. That would be too cruel, even revolutions have hearts. But they are stripped from government spending, banned from court, removed from coin engravings. Tulip-shaped accessories quietly disappear. The fragrance of rosewater fades from the fountains. A strange quiet settles over the city. Gardeners return to planting wheat. Poets stop comparing love to petals. Silk merchants switch to stripes and leave the florals behind. You walk past an abandoned bulb cart. The sign reads, "Buy one, get exile free." You chuckle softly and keep moving. In a tucked-away courtyard, you find a woman kneeling in the dirt. She's replanting tulips. Not for wealth, not for status, just for spring. "They'll bloom again," she says without looking up. "Not for the empire, just for us." And that, maybe, is the quiet heart of this strange chapter. The tulip didn't die. The fever did. The illusion of eternal elegance. The madness of measuring worth by fragrance. But the flower? It still remembers how to grow. A stillness settles over Istanbul. Not the silence of defeat, but the hush of something that knows when to bow. You walk slowly now, through wide boulevards and forgotten lanes, past shuttered gardens and broken fountains. It's the aftermath, and here, silence doesn't mean absence. It means remembering. The tulip beds lie empty. Where once there were lanterns, laughter, and whispered declarations of love disguised as flower metaphors, there is now bare earth. Some beds are being converted to vegetable plots, cabbages and onions where petals once fluttered. Others are simply abandoned, left to the mercy of wind, weeds, and memory. You step into one such garden, where the outlines of old paths remain like ghosts. The marble bench where two lovers argued about tulip pigment sits cracked and unused. A rusted watering can leans against a wall, forgotten. And near the garden's center, a single tulip blooms, small, orange, unbroken. Nobody tends it. And yet, here it is. You sit for a while watching it sway. Historians still argue what the tulip era really meant. Some call it a golden age of art and aesthetics. Others say it was decadence dressed in silk. But as you walk through these hushed remnants, it's hard not to feel like it was simply human. An empire choosing beauty in a moment when everything else might have pointed toward war. The people are quieter now. Not defeated, just grounded. In the palace, tulip motifs remain. Too intricately carved to be erased, too beautiful to be resented. No one polishes them anymore, but no one dares chisel them out either. You pass a wall panel of inlaid mother-of-pearl tulips. Dust gathers along their edges. The empire doesn't hate them. It just doesn't look at them much. You wander into a tea house where old men play backgammon. The room smells of mint and pipe smoke. One wears a faded robe with a tulip design stitched at the cuff. You catch him tracing it with a finger while staring out the window. Not nostalgia, not sadness, just memory. Children no longer name their pets Lael. The poets have moved on to pomegranates and the moon. You pass a bookseller's stall and spot an old volume titled Petals of the People. It's tucked behind a stack of military histories. You pull it out. Inside, pressed flat and dry, is a single white tulip. No note, no signature, just a flower that once meant everything. In a quiet neighborhood on the city's edge, a schoolteacher uses tulip metaphors to explain impermanence to his students. It blooms for a moment, he says. That's why we treasure it. One child asks, why not make a flower that lasts forever? The teacher smiles. Then it would stop being a gift. You stroll past the old garden competition grounds, now a public square with faded murals and the faint outline of where a fountain used to sing. Teenagers sit on the steps, playing music from a phone. One of them wears a tulip pin. He says it belonged to his grandmother. He doesn't know what it means. He just likes how it looks. The Sultan who replaced Ahmed III never quite understood the floral obsession. He focused on trade, defense, reforms, practical things. The imperial gardeners were reassigned. Some became clerks. Some became teachers. One opened a modest flower shop near the port. No rare bulbs, just fresh-cut flowers and smiles. You visit it. The owner, now in his 70s, offers you a tulip. They're out of style, he shrugs. But spring doesn't care about fashion. You accept it. The bloom is red with soft yellow fringes. Nothing exotic, just lovely. And yet, not everyone forgot. In a small room in the Imperial Archives, a scribe still catalogs tulip records. Not the prices, not the scandals, just the names. Someone should remember what we called them, she says. They had stories. You look over her shoulder. Whisper's End, Velvet Sigh, Emperor's Echo. Some names feel like lullabies, some like inside jokes. All of them precious. Even in the gardens of the common people, tulips make a quiet return. Not the rare, broken ones, just simple, solid-colored blooms. Grown in old pots, tended by calloused hands. You see them in window boxes, on balconies, in courtyards where children play. The flower is no longer a symbol of status. It's become a gesture, a small rebellion against dullness, a promise that something beautiful can grow again. You attend a modest spring festival in a coastal village. There are no silk tents, no lanterns, just laughter, grilled fish, and a game where children try to guess the name of different flower colors. One guesses sunberry, another, tired fire. You smile. Someone here was raised by a poet. As the sun sets, you walk along a ridge overlooking the Bosporus. The city stretches below you, old and new. Somewhere, a nightingale sings. Somewhere, a gardener dreams. And in your hand, still that red tulip. It's no longer heavy with history. It doesn't ask to be remembered. It just exists, blooming because it can. You remain on that ridge a little longer, watching the lights of Istanbul flicker to life. Fewer lanterns now, more bulbs, though of a very different kind. The air is cleaner here, touched by sea salt and wood smoke, and somewhere far below, the scent of a garden still lingers. It's the 21st century, and tulips are no longer currency, no longer scandal. But they're not gone. Not at all. You lean over a stone balcony and see them again. Bright, defiant, unapologetically soft. Welcome to the modern echoes of tulip love, hidden not in palaces or private festivals, but in balconies, public parks, and early morning markets. You stroll down the cobbled backstreets of Fatih and Ayub, where Ottoman architecture leans gently into the present, and something catches your eye. Terracotta pots on every ledge, and in them, tulips, hundreds of them, deep crimson, pale pink, canary yellow, none broken, none elite, just blooming. You pause beneath one balcony where an old woman waters her flowers. She doesn't look down, but calls out anyway. They grow better if you talk to them. You ask what she says. Mostly gossip, she replies. They're nosy like me. This is how tulips live now. Not as objects of power, but as part of life. Quiet companions on windowsills. Sunday market staples. Background singers in wedding photos. You visit Gulhane Park, once part of the Topkapi Palace Gardens. Now a public space where tulips stretch across green hills like paint spilled from the sky. Children run between rows, tourists kneel for selfies, and a group of teenagers dares each other to sniff the rarest bloom. Spoiler: it smells like a flower. They pretend it changed their life. Every April, Istanbul holds its annual tulip festival. You attend this one, wandering beneath trees draped in silk ribbons, past flower beds arranged in swirling ottoman motifs. No one calls it the tulip era. No one quotes ancient poets. But something is in the air. A warmth, a hush, a shared smile between strangers who've all just agreed, without saying a word, that this is lovely. You step onto a small wooden bridge over a stream lined with tulips, and hear a street musician playing a ney flute. The melody sounds vaguely familiar, maybe something old, maybe just something that feels old. You toss a coin into his case. He nods. This one's called Whispers of Red, he says. Named after a tulip my grandmother grew. Historians today are gentler with their verdicts. What was once called indulgent or foolish is now recognized as a moment of cultural tenderness. A civilization chose, even briefly, to lead with beauty, to believe that flowers mattered, that poetry had a purpose, that spring, no matter how fleeting, was worth waiting for. You visit the Istanbul Tulip Museum. It's small, tucked behind a row of cafes, barely advertised. Inside, old bulbs sit in glass cases, next to faded manuscripts and paintings of gardens long lost. One exhibit shows a broken tulip under magnification. The streaks look like brushstrokes. Next to it, a plaque reads, "Beauty, damaged, endured." There's a touchscreen display where visitors can name their own imaginary tulip. You watch someone type, "Sleepy Joy," another, "Hope's Elbow." A child types, "Purple Fireball 9000." The attendant nods approvingly. You take the tram across the Golden Horn and find a mural on the side of a building. It shows a janissary holding a tulip in one hand and a shield in the other. Beneath it, "Be fierce, be fragrant." Someone's idea of graffiti as history. On your final day, you return to the Galata district, where balconies spill over with plants like overfilled teacups. Tulips dance in the breeze, their stems swaying against wrought iron railings. You overhear a young man speaking to his date. They say a tulip can only be perfect for 7 days. She replies, "That's longer than most love songs." You smile. You've come full circle. Because while the empires fell and the markets collapsed and the poetry books yellowed in dusty attics, the tulip outlived it all. Not because it tried, not because it fought, but because it bloomed. Again and again. Quietly, softly, unreasonably. You buy a final tulip on your way out. A simple one, red with a yellow rim, sold by a woman in a floppy hat near the ferry dock. She wraps it in brown paper and hands it to you with a wink. Tell it something nice every morning, or it'll sulk. You take the flower and carry it with you to the pier. The ferry horn sounds. The city glows in the distance, and in your hand one last tulip faces the sea. Now, as the boat rocks gently beneath your feet and the city of Istanbul shrinks behind you like a dream sliding into memory, you hold that final tulip close. No longer a symbol, no longer a scandal, just a flower. And that brings you to the final, quiet truth of it all. How a flower outlasted an empire. You lean against the railing, sea spray on your face, the tulip trembling lightly in your hand. It's not rare. It's not broken. It's not even particularly symmetrical. But after all this time, after revolts, fashion wars, auctions, poems, smuggling rings, and broken dreams, it is here, alive, rootless but radiant. You think back to Sultan Ahmed III, lying on embroidered cushions, composing odes to tulips, to viziers building night festivals with 10,000 oil lamps, to painters swirling streaks into petals like they were divine whispers. They're all gone now, dust and footnotes. But the tulip? Still blooming. It's strange how history works. Great armies leave ruins. Philosophers leave tomes. Monarchs leave marble and myths. But sometimes, the thing that endures isn't the loudest or the sharpest. Sometimes it's a flower. And not even the strongest flower. Not the one that heals wounds or poisons enemies or feeds a starving city. Just one that shows up every spring, quietly. Opens, glows, and says, "Look." You wonder, was the tulip ever meant to be currency, or canvas, or catalyst for collapse? Or was it always just meant to be noticed, to be admired and then forgotten, only to surprise you next year by blooming again when you least expect it? Historians still argue about everything. Whether the tulip era was glorious or ridiculous. Whether it weakened the empire or expressed its finest soul. Whether it mattered at all. But the flower doesn't argue. It just returns. You stroll along the lower deck as seagulls trail the ferry, catching bits of bread from the passengers. A child giggles. Somewhere, someone is playing a recording of an old Ney tune on their phone. The notes warble in the wind. The tulip in your hand droops slightly, as if bowing. And you realize, this flower isn't here because it fought to survive. It's here because someone, somewhere always loved it enough to plant it again. And again. And again. The Ottoman Empire is history now. But the tulip? She's just getting started. Word count: 1072. Wind down, final 300 words. And now it's time to let the petals fall. Let the night draw over you like soft velvet. The air slowing, the mind softening. You've wandered through silk-draped gardens and smoky backrooms, walked with poets and smugglers, sultans and flower sellers. And all the while, a single bloom waited at the center. Quiet, constant, impossible not to love. Breathe in. You're no longer in a garden. You're in your room. But perhaps, if you listen, you can still hear the flutter of silk against marble, the drip of water from a tulip-shaped fountain, the hush of a story told by firelight. Maybe you can still smell the hint of rosewater and soil. Let that carry you. Let the empire fade into the shadows. Let the golden robes slip away, the music taper to silence. Let the palace doors close softly behind you, their hinges quiet with centuries. You've walked far. You've watched it bloom and break and bloom again. And now you rest. Imagine a tulip at your bedside. Just one. Simple. Still. No need to name it. No need to own it. It's just there. Existing. Breathing with you. Let it stand guard over your dreams. And when the morning comes, whenever it comes, you'll rise not with answers, but with softness, with quiet color, with the grace of something that was never supposed to last, and somehow still did. Good night, dreamer, and may your sleep bloom gently.